Hi, everyone. My name is Sangeeta. I'm the founder and CEO of Helpsy, and thank you so much for joining us today on this live chat. Today, we are here with Priya Soni, and our goal is to talk about caregiving and culture. Both Priya and I come from Indian background, but with very different perspectives, and we grew up in two different parts of the world. So we're going to be talking about caregiving from our perspectives. So let me tell you a little bit about Priya. Priya is a certified caregiving consultant, speaker, and writer. Um, she's a family caregiver, and she gets it what it is to be a caregiver. And she's building a movement about it for you and dedicated to you. She was caregiver for her father for 12 years as he moved through a mystery illness, a neurological condition that doctors were never able to diagnose. So she deeply understands that caregivers need more sources of support and is here to provide that through her coaching and program for mentors. Her experience encompasses not only a lived one, but she also has master's degree in disability studies. So she has developed understanding of what is needed for those who are aging and or to have a disability. So it's great to have both the personal experience and the trained education experience. Priya has been featured on NBC's Asian America Online, Women's Day Online, and she was on one of the issues of Women's Day magazine last year. And most recently, she was one of the winners of the 2018 Caregiving Visionary Award. So it's an honor to welcome Priya to our conversation today. Welcome, Priya.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm
Thank
excited about our conversation.
Same here. Same here. So let's get started. You and I come from slightly different. Um, um, Growing up, we both have the Indian descent, but you grew up here and I grew up in India. So let's first talk about how that culture has influenced caregiving. How was it for you? And I can share how it was for me.
Yeah, when I think about culture, I think about the beliefs and the values and the attitudes and how we live our life and just who we live it around. And then that influences the lens in which we're going to operate in our life. And so when I think about just my background, having grown up here with two parents who came over from different parts of India, different subcultures of India, and then met here, became citizens and lived their life and probably more than half of their life here, I think about what they brought over. And one of the things that they brought over, and as a child that I would sit at the table with my sister, was the value system. And inherent in that value system was you take care of people. Service, being of service is one of the most important things. Respecting your family. All of those things that I didn't know at the time of being somewhat of an antsy little girl, I didn't know that those things were setting me up for what I would need to inherently carry with me when caregiving became a real prominent part of my life. And so in a lot of ways, I was learning it along the way, and life was setting me up when I really do sort of a deep dive and reflect on the background of my life itself. So I think that culture is inherent in the care experience if we allow it to be. And sometimes with caregiving, it requires us to delve more into who we are as a person and where we're from and what matters to us, and then apply that to the experience itself. At times we do it just by realizing it, and other times it's sort of like it's like a heave ho, you're right there, and you just have to figure out like what's going to make a difference in this moment. And that lends itself to values, beliefs, and attitudes.
Yeah, so true. It's beautiful how our culture has the family values built into it. Because I think even for me, growing up, my great grandmother lived with us, and we got to see her. Um, getting old, getting sick, being there for her, and taking care of her until she passed away.
Mhm.
And that was just so much a part of what was it's a continuum of life where you grow up and your family takes care of you when you're a child, and then as you grow up into a able human being and your family is getting older, um, in turn we are taking care of them, and supporting them. So that continuum of life of seeing people from birth to death and being there for one another, I think is so much built into our culture and our values. um,
Mhm.
uh, right. And I remember, even growing up, my grandmother and I shared a room, so it was just my day-to-day responsibility to make sure that uh, her activities of daily living were done. Right, she woke up and she had washed herself, and
Mhm.
she had eaten, and if there was any risk for slipping, or any little household things, that was just part of my responsibility growing up. And I think even when we would go out, like for a trip or visit or something, um, I would be walking with her, so I was behind other people, but that was just part um, of what it meant to be in this family. So I think those values get so much inbuilt in our culture of being there for one another. um, and like you said, it sets us up um, for what's to come in future, and what values we inherently carry forward, for the rest of our life, and don't see those as a separate set of things that we need to suddenly do, right? um,
Yes, I completely agree. I think, and I was having this conversation with a friend of mine some time ago, that caregiving never felt like within my culture itself as this separate sort of entity, this separate part of you. It was always inherent into who we were growing up. And then when I would go visit India myself, when I was, up until being an adult, one of the things that really was memorable for me was just watching how even my little cousins would take care of my sister and me and my family whenever we would come visit, and how it was just such a natural thing to do, and something that they witnessed, and something that was taught to them by their parents. And then in addition, those particular things were taught to their parents, and just sort of
Mhm.
the passing down of tradition. And so this like tradition of care that just lives, and breathes in almost everything that we do. And I think when I think about culture too, I think of just, one of the main sort of spiritual texts, the Bhagavad Gita, which says, selfless service. And
Mhm.
that, for that to bring purity to your mind and body, to be able to give selfless service. And being like one of the number one practices that I know that I have been around, and that I guess is in my DNA and your DNA, and just by like just externally like what we see, and then also just how we feel, and what our makeup is.
So true, so true. I think, yeah, it's so much tied to our spirituality too, because like you mentioned in about Gita, right? It's
Hmm. Yeah,
your
the Bhagavad Gita. Yeah.
Bhagavad Gita, right? So your karma is your dharma, right? Means your duty is the way to
Mhm.
serve God, right? Or whoever your spiritual powers. I think that's built into it. The caregiving aspect is built into it. I also think at a deeper level, the seeing people for who they are through the ups and downs, and accepting them in that form, to some extent, it also gets built in because of that. Because
Mhm.
we are making sure that even as people become frail or sick, or whether it's it's big challenges in their life or it's big joys, we are tightly integrated with one another and supporting one another through those, whether it's celebrations or it's sorrows.
Mhm.
And I think that's another huge part of what ties people together in our culture. Um, and the other aspect is life and death. What I saw growing up was many of us had our relatives die at home, like grandparents and uncles, and uncles or aunts, grandparents, they passed away at home, and the ritual of death and dying and grieving or taking care of them during that time was also a part of our lives. We didn't see uh, we those things got built into our DNA and into our life experiences early on, versus it being totally separate, where we had never seen or experienced that, what it's like. And I think that's another really good value, um, that we get as being part of this culture, and many of the cultures that have caregiving and the tight family knit responsibilities built in.
And I think that you just hit on that. It's the family system.
Mm-hmm.
Where my father lived and where he grew up, there was a house with several generations in one home. Now, there's been a lot of modernization and things, especially in cities of India, where even just sort of like how we care for the elderly in India has changed and shifted over time. But there's also still a lot of experiences and a lot of families, whether it's sort of the villages or the rural areas, and even some of the cities, that they're still experiencing the family system and the multi-generational family in one home. And so you have this built-in support system, and you also have this built-in experience for kids as they're witnessing, what all of this looks like, and understanding that the respecting of the elders is really key
Mm-hmm.
in this experience, and understanding just the world as it is when it comes to taking care of one another.
Right. And I was wondering, Priya, if you want to talk a little bit about your experience as a caregiver here. I touched on a bit
Mhm.
taking care of my grandmother, growing up, and how that caregiving experience has been. I was wondering what landed you into caregiving and how that experience was here, since you took care of your dad here in US.
It's interesting because I've never thought of myself just entering into this world of caregiving. I didn't even know that that's what I was doing. I would say towards the end of the experience of the 12 years, I started to realize like, oh, this, like, as I start to seek out more help and I was more interested in some different spiritual texts and things like that. And I was looking for what it was. I realized, okay, so maybe this is what I've been going through is caregiving. I considered myself a dedicated daughter. And I think that journey came from always playing a role of caring for my family or taking care of them in a lot of different ways, even as a child, and being the eldest Indian daughter, and that sort of traditional lens into all of this. So when it happened for me, it was, of course, you get the call of, there's something going on, and then it becomes multiple doctor's visits. And because it was 12 years, there was over a course of time. So the care process looked really different as time went on. It started with my dad walking. His gait was very unsteady, and he was just sort of going from one step to the next step very, very difficultly, and with a lot of difficulty. And then it affecting his speech, where it became like slurred. And I start to work with his speech. I had an acting background, so I could help him with the vocal training. And you can see just how life has set me up in different ways to be able to take what I've learned and apply it to this experience. And because really I was grasping at whatever I could at the time. I didn't think about life setting me up for this. I was just seeing something that seemed like a crisis and being able to say, okay, what do I know that can actually help? And then um, having happen in a way that was pretty positive for him and for me, and in a way where I could feel like I had even just a semblance of control in the experience. And then it moved to him using a walker, to him using a power chair, to him having speech aphasia, which means he wasn't able to speak. He just lost his ability to speak. So it was, again, then pulling from my background and helping him learn American Sign Language, just bits and pieces, things that, hand shapes and things that he could do so I could understand, so he could feel heard. And so also in turn so I could also feel heard when I was speaking to him. And so there was like this, again, this like partnership of focus and partnership of just working together in the experience. It didn't mean that we didn't have difficult moments. I think the care experience is one that it has a multitude of emotions, and it can lend itself to very traumatic moments and very traumatic, experiences for many. And it can also lend itself to like these moments where you have like this epiphany, and you just realize, wow, I just sort of like delved as deep as I possibly could with this experience. And if we allow it, we realize that there's a question I always say, what was in the making of me from this experience, and what is in the making of me from this experience, and being able to take from both those painful moments and those moments where I just had those moments of epiphany, and just those moments of, elation, because something was happening, something was helping, and really sort of like, again, taking that and making it a through line into the experience itself as a whole.
I think you brought up so many good points here, Priya, about when we talk about the impact of caregiving on us. A lot of times life didn't, it just happens, right? We didn't sign up to become a caregiver. We didn't take a course in it. It just happens. We get a call, and here we are trying to do the best we can for our loved ones. And suddenly we need to be ready and trained for something that we never signed up. I think part of what we were discussing earlier, the culture helps in that. If we have seen that and growing up, and looks like you kind of face that, I think that's something many of us get put into that situation, and then we are trying to figure out what is it that we can do right now in this moment to get through for all of us. How do we support our loved one through these difficult moments? And we're trying to grasp at the skill sets that we have, or the resources that we have. So I think that was a really important point that you brought up. And the other one is, it results in a new type of partnership, because the relationship or the dynamics of the relationship we have with our parents can change when when this loved one becomes sick. I saw that happening too especially with my father. He went through open heart surgery. So someone who's used to being the head of the family and the decision maker, and being the male lead, coming from a traditional background, suddenly the roles were shifted a little bit, because now he needed support of his family, and especially of me as the eldest daughter. And we had to form a new type of communication to make things work. Right. So I think that was another really important point you brought up, is about how we can recognize that the relationships dynamics will change, and it can be a little bit difficult, and it's about figuring that out between us so that we can find a way to move forward. Another important point you brought up was, what is this experience teaching me about myself? Right. And through a lot of these difficult moments, we learn so much about ourselves, about where we see our own positivity and our own flaws, and how we try to work through those, because those are possibly new emotional muscles that we haven't exercised. And it teaches us a lot about ourselves. And I think that's a really good point for us as caregivers to realize that and to honor that in us, because it's a new role we got put into. And how we are managing these new moments, new experiences in our life, uh, and learning from that and learning to get through. So I think rewarding ourselves, appreciating ourselves is really, really important too, in such moments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think also just understanding that it's okay to be with the pain. It's natural. This is a really hard, really sad experience. And grief, the journey of grief starts before anything happens that feels very final. And it's, we grieve in the moment of hearing that something has shifted with the person in our life, the family member that we're caring for. We grieve for ourselves in these moments. We just don't really know the answer to questions and what to do. And it looks like frustration and anger, but a lot of it is really based in grief. And we grieve throughout the experience itself with just the different sort of losses, because there's a lot of losses in these moments. But along with it, and I call it just a story full of color, is also like those moments that we're learning about ourselves. We're not the same. We're never the same as like time goes on. But caregiving really feels raw in so many ways, and we realize that, and we can actually see. I remember being able to sort of see the woman that I was, and not being her anymore, and just sitting in those places of like, who am I? Like who, and just really trying to grasp on to saying, who am I in this moment? And not having a lot of time to really sit with it. But I remember like trying to find this sense of identity of myself, because so much of my life had changed. And it wasn't in an instant, and it was over the course of times. For some, it is in an instant. But it was being able to sit with that, and in the moments that I sort of fell to the ground, but also being in the moments and saying, okay, now let's rise up and try to figure something out. And that's the amazing thing about caregivers. They're the toughest, most amazing people I have ever met, even when we don't always feel like it. We show up. That
Right.
says a lot.
Yeah, it,
That
it
says a
it
lot.
does. It does, because that's the biggest thing we can do in the moment is be there, show up. I think one thing you talked about here was the grief. We're grieving so many things, right? The relationship with that person, how it used to be, potential loss of life for that person. I think being a cancer nurse, and having seen so many loved ones pass away from cancer, knowing that that's their end. To one extent, on one side, the way emotionally you're trying to deal with it is learning to let go, but on the other side, you are the one deeply caring for this person, which builds even more intimacy. So there is this emotional, uh, so many colors that are being painted across. Um, right. I think some of the other challenges that we see as caregivers, I've experienced, and I think in literature, and we are seeing with many of us, uh, is with the toll it takes on us, in terms of the additional responsibilities. We all live in such a super packed, time packed world, where every minute of our time is already allocated to things. We don't have a lot of time to spare. And then when the responsibility of caregiving comes in, especially for, I think, for tight knit, or nuclear families, smaller families, it's a huge amount of work that falls on our plate. So where do you squeeze in the time to do all these things along with handling your own emotions? Um, part of caregiving, the other aspect, the other challenge of this is also um, the financial uh, burden that comes with caregiving or with healthcare. As we know, even for cancer, about 40% of cancer patients go bankrupt um, because of their own cost that they have to put in uh, for cancer treatment, right? Which means that those families are really struggling financially, right? So then where is the money for it? You have the additional pressure of being able to provide for the family. So you need to go to work, make sure you're doing a good job, stay on top of your work, but you also have all this responsibility of um, taking your loved one to the doctor's visit, taking care of all the household things, picking up kids, all those things, right? So I think there is the huge financial burden that comes with it. There is the emotional stress that comes with becoming the breadwinner for the family, and there is the physical exhaustion and the emotional exhaustion that comes with being a caregiver, because you're just on the go, just trying to stretch thin and handle everything, right? So I think there are a lot of challenges um, that we face as caregivers. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about that from your experience, as well as from what you see in working with other people and in literature?
I think you touched on a lot of them. I think there's the top of mind ones that come are time,
Mhm.
just time for even the small things, whether it's painting my nails or, just to feel some semblance of normalcy that they had felt before. And when in those moments when you can't do those particular things, realizing, wow, it really has changed. So being able to create that time and that respite for themselves, or it's just time to be able to think, or time just to be, whatever it is, or time to just to make their favorite recipe, whatever it is that gives them some sense of comfort in this moment that can feel very uncomfortable. Caring can be, an uncomfortable place to be at times, especially when you've been going through it every day, day in and day out, and you have other family members. You might be married, you might be doing this on your own, whatever it might be. The other thing that I have found is, and that I feel is very prevalent, is this isolation and loneliness.
Mhm.
It's just, I think sometimes we don't even recognize how deep it is, because a lot of times even just talking about it with people doesn't feel the way it's accepted by others can feel different, and it doesn't feel as comforting to the person who's sharing it out. I think we live in a society where successful aging is one of the things that people would prefer to talk about, well-being, all these things that are extremely important. But when there's a situation, when there's pain and there's crisis and there's grief and loss and all of those particular things, we haven't always really understood, particularly in this culture, how to speak about it,
Mhm.
and how to create space for it, and how to just listen. Because one of the other things that I would say is people want to feel heard and validated for who they are. I've always, stated this in past conversations with people. We're never having the conversation about what's going on. The relationship is the conversation itself, and that comes from Fierce Conversations, a book by, I believe, Susan Scott. Where it's how we're being with each other. And I think the thing about caregiving is that it asks us to slow down, and in a lot of ways it speeds us up, because we have a list of many, many, many things to do, and yet a lot of times we're working with somebody who's working on very different time, and looks at time very differently, because of necessity needs, and also because of perhaps how they now reflect on life. So those are like the top three things that come to mind. And all of these things are going to affect emotional and physical well-being over the course of time.
Oh, that's so beautiful the way you said it. I love it, Priya. About how it speeds us up with so many things to do, but yet it slows down in terms of the actual relationship with that loved one because that time has changed. And you talked about how we focus a lot on wellness and where we want to be. Um, and it I think one important thing for us to talk about is on one side we are living in a society where the focus is so much on success, whether it's success in professional life or in health and well-being. We talk a lot um, about those expectations from ourselves and from what we expect in one another, how the community views us. And on the other side of it is all the expectations that come with being a caregiver, or all the responsibilities that we are handling, and they seem invisible at times or not valued enough. You talked about being heard and listening and being appreciated for those. And I think that a lot of times that aspect that takes up so much of our uh, time, effort, investment, and is actually really valuable part of our life in terms of that relationship. Somehow it does not translate into the way the world sees success, or how we see success for ourselves in the world. And that ties very tightly to the cultural expectations too, right? Like where we started talking about, it's part of our culture in terms of what we do, especially for us as women. At the same time, we are both professional women. So do you see this dichotomy, this internal conflict, and what kind of thoughts and suggestions you have about that?
The internal conflict about care itself in our life through this experience of caregiving.
Yeah, the conflict between needing to focus on career and profession that takes up all the time and effort versus caregiving, and whether that's valued or not, in terms of the effort we are putting in there.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing. Working and taking care of a family member is, I've heard that conflict for people over time. I've experienced that conflict, but not, luckily, I've had great places I've worked at. And when I was interviewing for those places, one of the most important things, specifically one particular place that I interviewed at, one of the most important things was that I could work remotely, that I could be mobile, that I could move, because at any moment in time, I knew a crisis could hit. And we were, I used to call myself a manager of crises, and now a researcher of care. So dedicated daughter and caregiver, and then to manager of crises to researcher of care is how I consider myself now in a lot of ways. But I think one of the biggest things that this process of care taught me was communication. How am I communicating to the people that I work with? How am I setting expectations? What is it that I'm talking about with them? Again, that partnership quality. How am I partnering with somebody to be able with the person that I'm working with, to be able to make sure I can do the work, but perhaps at different times, whatever that might be. Communication was always key. That was always the key for me to sort of work with my particular work situations. Sometimes that's not easy for others. Sometimes women of different ages might feel different challenges, and that's just a reality of it. This is another thing that caregiving does. It asks us to be our own advocates in these particular situations and to seek out others who've also experienced it as well. It brings out our voices.
Yeah, that's so important. I think most of us in US at some point, not just US, anywhere in the world, are caregivers just by the nature of who we are. And as we have balanced professional life and personal life, I think the point you brought up about communication is so important, because right now our society is starting to realize the amount of effort we have to put in as caregivers and professionally figure out a way to support employees, members, however you want to name us. Um, but I think that awareness needs to rise, that that is part of our life. And then how do we get support for it? Some companies have programs and flexible schedule, like you mentioned. Others don't. And I think it goes back to that communication of how do we express our need in in a clear, concise, positive way. How do we negotiate those relationships so that we can find a way to move forward? um, doesn't work all the time for everyone, unfortunately. And I think that's where, as a society, as well as, you know, on the professional side, we need to raise more awareness about the role of a caregiver and what kind of support we need. And I think it's great you're doing that. um, but yeah, very good point about what we can do now is communication, and becoming an advocate for ourselves, and
Mhm.
then working in society to raise more awareness for it. Um,
Mhm.
I, I want to focus last few minutes on resources that you think would be helpful for other caregivers, to for them to get through life. What have you seen and found helpful that you would like to share?
Sure. One resource that doesn't cost anything is finding 5 minutes by just getting up 5 minutes in the morning or going to bed, 5 minutes just a little later, and closing your eyes and listening to your breath, breathing. It's meditation. It sounds like it is something that we can't do or that's difficult to do, and it takes 5 minutes just to bring you down to that moment, but just allowing yourself that consistent experience is something that you will find will help you and will change the course of your day and how you're handling the experience for yourself and for others. I would also say that if people are open to it, seek out a group of people, whether it's a support group or just a tribe of men or women that you feel very comfortable with, and let that be your community and share what it is that you need. Perhaps it's because of cultural reasons, perhaps it's within your own culture, perhaps it's a group that you started at work. Whatever it is, create a semblance of a safe space and a supportive space, so you can share, you know, any grievances that you might have or any thoughts that you might have, or share some of the things that have worked for you, whatever it might be. There's a lot of them out online. For me, I tend to be an in-person type of person. I like to go and be around people. That sort of is what gives me energy. So just sort of know what's going to help you show up consistently into those spaces. And perhaps for people right now, online is the only way, given their particular experience, and being able to, you know, find respite for themselves. And the other thing is seek out books that have a sense of peace and calm for yourself, or any, you know, whether it's a poem or a quote or just like these like small things. What I'm giving people right now are things where they can just like do this right by their computer. They can turn on music to listen to some meditation on YouTube. They can go to look for a chat place online very quickly, and they can just go read some quotes online. Those particular things, it's about a shift in rhythm, just a little bit, just getting a taste of it, and then letting it build. I always say, you know, small steps, big difference.
That's so beautiful. Small steps, big difference. I love it. And I love all the resources you shared. And I know that on your, excuse me, on your Instagram, you share a lot of resources every week on little things that you can do to take care of yourself. You touched on quite a few of those. I encourage everyone to go check out your page. I'll post a link here at the bottom of the video, so you can have a look about some of the resources that Priya talked about. And I think we were just discussing, as Priya was mentioning, it's important to recognize when we have become a caregiver, because sometimes life just happens, and um, we become a caregiver, and that comes with its own set of pros and cons, with changes to our life. So being aware of that and recognizing how we deal with this moment, how we can care for ourselves and for our loved ones as we are going through it, finding sanity in that chaos is so very important. So I hope, to all our viewers, I hope this conversation has been helpful in reflecting on what you experience as a caregiver, um, what cultural components you see, what conflicts you see, what joys you see, um, what obstacles you face, and hopefully that some of the resources and ideas that Priya has shared here can bring some support to you. It's an important topic for us to recognize and to find our voice, so that together as a society, we can be there to support one another and get through life. um,
Can I just say one thing?
yes, Priya,
Also,
closing.
just for people to know, my services and what I can be a resource as well. I'm there as a coach to help people move through the throes of caregiving, as well as helping people become mentors from the experience of caregiving. But there are so many of people out there who are certified caregiving consultants, or people who are creating these spaces and these entities, these unique value adds from their experience of caregiving. And know that the help is out there, and it's just one click away. So they can visit me at priyasoni.net, and I can give them that information, and they can be on their way to feeling more care for themselves.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Priya. Yeah, there's so many great resources out there. Go visit, check out Priya's site, and other caregiving resources. I think one benefit for us living in the tech world is that we can connect with one another and find resources more easily. So do find your your sanity, your home in the middle of chaos. And I wish you the very best. Thank you so much for joining us on this chat. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you so much, Priya, for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.